Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Alhamdulillah. This is now episode 71 of the podcast, The Forward, with myself, Brother Mahdi Locke. And today we are going to follow up on the topic of Waqf from the last podcast, The Wonders of Waqf. And insha'Allah do a series focused on the rulings of Waqf, or what I would call a summary of the rulings of Waqf, because they are very, very detailed if one looks at the bigger books of fiqh. And what I'm going to focus on, what I'm going to use, is the book I translated 5-6 years ago, or was published 5 years ago. And this is, it's called the Book of Endowment, and it's based on the Book of Waqf in Mughni al-Muhtaj by Al-Khatib al-Shirbini, right, which is one of the great mother books in Shafi'i fiqh. Now, what I did with that book when I translated it several years ago is, in order to introduce the topic of Waqf and give a summary of its rulings, I added the chapter from another Shafi'i fiqh book, a smaller one, called Sharh al-Yaqut al-Nafis, which has a sharh and a metin, a main text and a commentary, summarizing the rulings of Waqf, the definitions of the terms, the conditions, the pillars, and so on and so forth. So what I would like to do over a few episodes of this podcast is go over these rules and summarize them. Now, I expect this to take maybe 3 to 4 episodes, because I don't want to do this as one long 2, 3, 4 hour episode. I would prefer to break this down into half-hour sessions. So I think that would be more digestible, and with Allah alone is every success. So the book Sharh al-Yaqut al-Nafis, the edition I have that I translated from is Dar al-Minhaj edition. So it's from pages 483 to 491. And in the book I translated, which was the Book of Waqf, published in Malaysia in 2014, it is from pages 1 through to 16. And so bear in mind here that the author of the text, the one who writes the metin, the one who writes the sharh, these people are one and the same person. So in the metin, the main text, the author says, in the Arabic language, the term waqf means habs, right? So waqf is this term that's usually translated as endowment, but its original meaning is habs, and habs means to obstruct, to shut off, to confine, or to retain. Right, so this is the idea that we're talking about property that's going to be confined or obstructive, or obstructed or shut off. In the revealed law, in the Sharia, it means to retain property, right? Or you could also say to confine, to shut off, to retain property that is specific and owned, whose ownership is transferable, and it can be benefited from while the property itself remains. And this is by suspending disposal of it while the financial proceeds go towards something that is permissible and existent. So now we have to break down terms. This is very, very important. So we say it is property that is specific. So in the Arabic text, it is mu'ayyin. It's specific, or it's specified. I.e., it is not something that is merely in one's safekeeping, nor something vague, like one of two slaves. Okay, so it has to be something that you actually own, and it's specific. It can't be something that is merely in your possession, merely that something under your care. It's something that you own, and it's specific. So it can't be one of a group of things you own. You can't say, well, I'm dedicating one of my cars, or one of my trees, or one of my properties, or whatever it is. No, it has to be specified. And it has to be mamluk. So you can't make, as a footnote, the endower, who's called the waqif, he cannot make an endowment of something that is rented, for example, or something that is borrowed. It has to be something owned. Then the word transferable in Arabic, qabil al-naql, or qabil al-naql. So, and this in the footnote he says this would exclude a slave woman who has a child by her master, and a slave who has a contract of manumission, mukatif, because their ownership cannot be transferred. So this is just an example he gives. There's ownership that cannot be transferred. And then the next thing is that it can be benefited from. Now this means, in the footnote he says, even if it is something that can only be benefited from in the future, such as a small donkey or a small animal or a young slave, but what cannot be benefited from is excluded, such as a chronically ill donkey that is never expected to recover. So you cannot make an endowment of something that cannot be used or will not be used. That's not going to work. And then the property itself has to remain. And in the footnote he says, even if only for a short period of time, the minimum being the time in which it would be feasible for it to be rented out or hired. This excludes what cannot be benefited from unless it is eliminated, such as a candle used for lighting, food for eating, or basil leaves that have been cut off for their scent. It is not valid to make an endowment out of any of these things. So you can't make an endowment of something that's not going to last long enough to be rented or hired, and you can't make an endowment of something that would actually be consumed and exhausted by using it, such as a candle. And then the other term that comes up here is it says that the financial proceeds go towards something that is permissible. So the waqf itself should be said to benefit something permissible. It should go towards a permissible end, i.e. not something haram or unlawful. And it has to be existent, something that's permissible and existent. And he makes a footnote, the author, he says, i.e. in the present time, as it is not valid to make an endowment for someone who will be born to the endower, and then for the poor. And this is called munqati'. Al-awwal, the first recipient of the endowment is cut out or cut off. So you want to benefit something that exists now. We're not thinking about someone who hasn't been born yet or something that hasn't come into existence yet. We want to benefit people now in the present time. Now, in the commentary, so we've gone over the terms, and I hope they're clear. The commentary, the author says, this chapter is the chapter on waqf. And waqf is one of the great acts of charity that have many immense virtues because it is a continuous, ongoing charity, i.e. a sadaqah jariyah. This is what you find in all the Shafi fiqh books on this topic. The idea of sadaqah jariyah, that the Messenger of Allah ﷺ mentioned in hadith, this is what you leave behind. This is one of the three things that someone leaves behind after they've left this world. The fuqaha of the Shafi madhab understand sadaqah jariyah to mean waqf. So the author continues, he says, this is mentioned in the hadith of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when the son of Adam dies, his deeds come to an end except for three. And the first is ongoing charity. In the footnote, the rest of the hadith mentions knowledge that is benefited from and a righteous child who supplicates for him. And this hadith has been narrated by Imam Muslim in his Sahih on the authority of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. And the author mentions that there's one narration where knowledge is mentioned before the righteous child. They have said, i.e., this is the fuqaha of the Shafi madhab, indeed Imam al-Rafi explained the meaning of ongoing charity and said that it could only apply to waqf, and the scholars have agreed with him in this. So I'm speaking on behalf of the Shafi madhab. I don't know, this could be the same in the other madhabs, the Maliki school or the Hanbali school. It could be the same thing. But I'm quoting the other madhab, the Shafi madhab here, and I don't want to quote the other madhabs without certainty. The author continues. He says, waqf took place in the time of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and many of the companions of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made endowments out of some of their wealth and made it a retained, continuous charity. They include Abu Talha, who made an endowment out of Bayruha for the closest of his relatives, and our master, Umar al-Khattab, who made an endowment out of his share from Khaybar. He made it a continuous endowment and permitted his son to eat directly from it and to feed passers-by. He also wrote out a document stipulated what he had made as an endowment. And it's a footnote on Bayruha. It's a well-known garden, as mentioned by Ibn Hajar in Tuhfat al-Muhtaj, Bishar al-Minhaj, and is one of the most beloved of his properties, as mentioned by Khatib al-Shirbini in the same book. This is actually covered in the main text or the main body of the book that I translated. Some of them said, indeed, Our Lady Fatima, peace be upon her, made endowments and ordered for endowments to be written down. She made them for her relatives and the women of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The details of what she wrote have been related from some of the scholars. They have said, indeed, most of the wealthy men of the helpers, i.e. the Ansar, made endowments out of their properties, and most of their property was date palms. Likewise, our predecessors in Hadramaut, because again, the scholar who's writing this is Imam Muhammad bin Ahmed bin Omar al-Shatiri, is a Yemeni, so hailing from Hadramaut. So likewise, our predecessors in Hadramaut, it is rare that you will find property, especially in Du'an, that does not contain an endowment. In Tarim, there were many acts of charity, and the endowments reached such a degree that they made endowments for the pigeons of the sacred precinct, i.e. the Haram. This is referring to the sacred precincts in Mecca and Medina, including the house of Jubair, i.e. one of the families there. They say, back in the days that they were inhabited, that these included some patches of arable land that were made as an endowment for the pigeons of the sacred precinct. When the crop was harvested, the amount gathered from the endowment for the pigeons of the sacred precincts, the amount gathered from the endowment for the pigeons of the sacred precinct was transported to the two sacred precincts, i.e. Mecca and Medina, to be given to them. The author continues, he says, even strangers, that in Tarim we have an endowment for foundlings, i.e. abandoned or deserted children whose parentage is unknown. One of the scholars has told me that in the Levant, in Sham, there is a place that contains an endowment for every vessel that is broken by a servant, and that servant has to pay for it. And this is something that's mentioned. So in the book Wonders of Waqf, which I released just a couple months ago, or 6 weeks ago, which is a translation of certain chapters from the book Hadaratina by Mustafa Sibai. That's actually mentioned in there. This, what was called the Zabadi endowment in Damascus. So it's like a vessel, or because Zabadi means yogurt, so it's essentially a yogurt dish. And it's not just for slaves or servants, but it's also for children. So if a child breaks his, let's say he's sent out by his parents to go pick up some yogurt, and on the way back, he drops the vessel and breaks it, he just goes to this waqf, gets a brand new one, brings it home, and no one's the wiser. So, and things like this are mentioned because they show that these awqaf, the plural of waqf, were covering so many needs of society. The orphans were being taken care of, widows were being taken care of, educational needs were taken care of, the chronically ill were taken care of. So many things and people were being taken care of that people, the Muslims, out of desire for reward, had to be really, really creative and think, okay, what can I do? What can I set up that would benefit the Muslims, that would alleviate some hardship, that would remove some harm from people? What can I do? And it gets reduced to this, like, okay, let's make a waqf for the benefit of pigeons. Let's make a waqf for the benefit to replace broken yogurt dishes. This is how far Muslims were going with awqaf, because this is how many needs. This is an indication of how many needs and wants. Not because by needs I mean not just emergencies and urgent matters, but less urgent matters are being taken care of. So what happens is, he says here regarding this Zabadi endowment, to replace the vessel, it says that what the person does is he brings the broken vessel to the overseers of the endowment, informs them that he was broken by him, and then they take it from him and pay him the equivalent price, after which he goes and he buys a replacement. Right? Whereas I think with the other endowment, it was the case where they just replaced it up front, as mentioned by Mustafa Sibai. Allah knows best. The author continues. He says, this is how our predecessors would diversify acts of charity. due to their intense enthusiasm to compete in acts of righteousness. The endowments were many, and some still survive to this day, while others have fallen into ruin, including those that have been taken over by oppressors. Because the nature of endowment is that we want it to last as long as possible. And the person who sets it up, the Waqf, he wants that benefit to be ongoing until the Day of Judgment, obviously. Because that's what it is. It's a sadaqah jariyah. It's an ongoing charity. And this is why, as I mentioned before in the podcast on the Wonders of Waqf, it's very normal when the endower writes out the waqfiyah, the actual document stipulating what the endowment is and how it is to be implemented. It's normal to say, may Allah's curse be on whoever changes this, or whoever destroys this, and so on and so forth. They have said that the value of the endowments of Imam al-Sayyid Abdullah Ba'alawi for the Ba'alawi Masjid reached 90,000 dinars in that time. And in a place called Nuwaydira Tarim, they found 21 wells in some of the best places in terms of land and value. Some of the best places, and they were endowment from an endowment from the family of Munafir al-Hamid for that masjid, and that is why the imamate was amongst them, i.e., of the masjid, right? So the imams of the masjid were from this family because they had given so much, they had endowed so much wealth for the benefit of that masjid. As for endowments for guests, this exists in abundance in Islamic countries. And again, if you go back to the Wonders of Waqf, just those chapters about hospitals and schools, this is how it was set up. The fact that people could be treated and stay in hospitals for free of charge. Students could come and travel and study in schools and universities and have free board. It was free of charge. They weren't charged anything. And some of these still exist. Some of these awqaf still exist in certain parts of the Muslim world, where you can show up and stay somewhere in a hostel free of charge, because something has actually been set up, not just for students. It's not just for students or sick people, but just set up for visitors, set up for travelers, set up for guests. People have free room and board just for showing up. Now, the Imam continues, let me go back into the language here. So he says, in the Arabic language, waqf means to obstruct, right? Because again, waqf literally means to stop, right? If you go anywhere in the Arab world, the stop sign says qif, which is the command form, stop. But waqf means to obstruct someone, to stop someone from doing something. So he says, for example, you can say, we obstructed so-and-so from traveling. I awqafna fulanin ala safar. We stopped so-and-so from traveling. Similarly, the Exalted One has said in Surah Al-Safat, the 37th chapter, verse 24, and call them to a halt, they will be asked, which the ayah is وَقِفُوهُمْ إِنَّهُمْ مَسْعُولُونَ, right? Stop them or call them to a halt, they will be asked. The author continues and he says, in the revealed law, it means to retain property that is specific and owned, whose ownership is transferable, and it can be benefited from while the property itself remains. And this is by suspending disposal of it while the financial proceeds go towards something that is permissible and existent. Right? So this is in the commentary, but it's basically a repetition of what was stated in the metin. Now, the next section we move on to is the pillars of the endowment, the arkan of the waqf. So the pillars of the endowment are four. We have the endower, which is the waqif, the beneficiary of the endowment, the mawquf alayh, the dedicated article, which is the mawquf, and the form, which is the sigha. So the Imam, the author continues, he says, the pillars of an endowment. The pillars of an endowment are four: the endower, the beneficiary of the endowment, the dedicated article, and the form. If Zayd, so this is just a name of a person, a generic person. If Zayd were to have a plot of land containing date palms. And he said, I have made these date palms an endowment for the poor. Such a form of endowment comprises the four pillars. We have Zayd, who he's the endower or the Waqf. He's made an endowment out of a specific property, i.e. these date palms, the plot of land. And the dedicated property is to be benefited from, while the property itself remains by suspending disposal of it. Rather, the spending is in the proceeds going to the poor. These poor people represent something that is specific and present, and at this point the four pillars emerge. So just to recap here, the endower is Zayd. The dedicated article, the mawquf, is the plot of land containing the date palm. So this is what is going to stay in existence, going to remain while the benefit goes to someone else. So the dedicated article is the plot of land containing the date palms. The beneficiary of the endowment is the poor, and the form, the sigha, is Zayd's statement, I have made these date palms an endowment for the poor. Okay, so these are the four pillars of the endowment, and then the Imam says each pillar has its own conditions. But these are the four essential things. So what this means, what we can draw from this, and I also mentioned this before in the podcast on the wonders of Waqf, is that a Waqf does not always have to be a major project. It doesn't always have to be a hotel or an apartment building or a house, and then the proceeds from that, from the rent or whatever, are going towards something. No, it can be something very, very small. It doesn't always have to be date palms. It doesn't have to be land. It can be simply a book. You could dedicate a mushaf to a masjid. You could dedicate some chairs. So, and it's very common, I see this a lot in the Muslim world especially. You know, you see a chair in the masjid, it says waqfun lillah. Waqfun lillahi ta'ala. That chair is simply it's something that someone has left behind in the masjid for anyone who is ill or infirm or elderly and they cannot stand in the prayer or go into sujood properly or ruku', do all the normal actions of the prayer. There's a chair for them. You can do the same thing with a mushaf. You can do the same thing with a book of fiqh or a book of tafsir. You can leave it in the masjid, and as long as you make it clear, you can say, for example, I've made these books an endowment for the people who pray in this masjid, and that's it. It's done. You are the waqif. The dedicated article is the book or the mushaf. The beneficiaries are the people who pray in the masjid, and the form is your statement. Now, let's go over the conditions. So about 23 minutes in, so we'll probably cover the conditions of the endower and maybe the conditions of the beneficiary of the endowment. So the conditions of the endower, the waqif, are two. There are two conditions: free choice and full competence to donate whilst alive. So the meaning of free choice, this is in the footnote, the author says, an endowment is not valid from someone who is forced without right. As for with right, an example would be someone vowing to make an endowment out of part of his wealth and then refraining from doing so after making the vow. And the ruler, the hakim, can force him to do it, in which case the endowment would be valid. If he still refrains from doing it, the ruler can then step in himself and make an endowment, and he can dedicate to where he thinks benefit is. Right? So the ruler can actually take over the endowment, so to speak, and dedicate it towards what he thinks is beneficial. So it comes down to his discretion. As for to donate whilst alive, which is the second condition of the endower, it is not valid. This again in the footnote. It is not valid for someone who is suspended from transactions, i.e. mahjur alayh, due to prodigality, safa, but his bequest is valid if his wasiyah, even if he dedicates his house, because such suspension is lifted after his death. And that is another section of fiqh, when someone can be mahjur alayh. This is when someone is reckless with money. They're just thoroughly irresponsible, and therefore they are barred from transactions because they're so irresponsible and reckless, and so much money is being wasted. Their guardian or whoever can step in, the qadi can step in, and that person can be suspended from transactions. However, in the case of wasiyah, which is the bequest, this is valid even if such a person dedicates his house, because such suspension is lifted after his death. Now, we go back to the commentary now, the Sharh. This is what the author actually says in the Sharh, because what we just read was the footnotes. The first condition is free choice. As for the action of someone who is forced, as we have repeated several times, it is not considered. If an individual were forced to dedicate some property by someone who is capable or someone who is able to implement his coercion, the endowment would not be valid. And just an interesting side note here, in the books of fiqh, there is a chapter called the Bab al-Iqra, the chapter on coercion. And coercion, as we should understand, coercion is usually in the form of a threat. Someone says, you have to do this, and if you don't, I will do such and such to you, right? I will kill you, I will beat you up, I will put you in prison. It's not valid threat, and therefore it's not valid coercion, unless the person making this threat is actually capable of carrying it out. So someone can't threaten you with prison and therefore force you to do something, unless they actually have the executive power to put you in prison. This is what is meant by this statement. So it has to be, if an individual were forced to dedicate some property by someone who is able to implement his coercion, the endowment would not be valid. The second condition is full competence to donate the dedicated article, for it is not valid to dedicate that which one does not own. Full competence to donate also means that the endower is sane, mature, and not suspended from transactions, and it is conditioned that is shared by both the endower and the dedicated article, i.e., the property that the endower is to dedicate must be something that can be donated. So to recap, the second condition is full competence to donate the dedicated article, for it is not valid to dedicate that which one does not own. So as we mentioned before, you cannot dedicate something as a waqf if it's something that you're merely borrowing from someone or something you've rented. You don't actually own it. So the next section is the conditions of the beneficiary of the endowment, but what I will do, inshallah, is I think because we are approaching the half-hour mark, I will stop there and I will go ahead and upload this section. We'll call this part 1, a summary of the rulings of waqf, and inshallah, well, at the same time, I will take the section that I went over today and I'll put that on my blog for listeners to read themselves and have access to the knowledge, inshallah. And if you have questions, if there's anything here that I've missed out or something that you would like further explanation of, please leave a comment below the video or maybe on my blog, and inshallah I will get back to you either in the comments or I will cover it when I do part 2. So part 2, I might do it next weekend or I might do it in 2 weeks. It depends. Again, I want to give listeners time to digest this, to take notes, to reflect on it. I don't want to overload people. And with Allah alone is every success. So I will finish here for this part. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.